You're listening to Confessions of a Counselor podcast. Here we will talk all things mental wellness.
Hi everyone, it's Janice here and welcome back to Confessions of a Counselor. Today I thought we would talk about resistance. So this is something that oftentimes we resist talking about in therapy because it's an uncomfortable conversation. We don't want to think about the fact that we might be resistant to things. We don't want to think about the fact that therapy might be tough or difficult or stir up things that we weren't ready to stir up. And so we need to be honest about the fact that in therapy, resistance is going to happen, right? So it's not whether, it's not like whether or not it's going to happen or maybe resistance might happen. It's almost guaranteed. It's almost guaranteed that resistance is going to show up at some point in therapy. And so we need to have awareness of that. And we need to be able to talk about the fact that we're experiencing resistance, right? So that feels uncomfortable, or I don't want to do that, or Janice, that's a stupid idea, right? All of these things are okay. It's okay to say that. It's okay to have resistance. It's okay to say, I'm not good at that, or I can't do that, right? These are all different ways in which resistance can show up. And when we can understand that resistance is a part of therapy and that it's not about saying, okay, we're done now. It's then about going a little bit deeper and figuring out what's underneath that resistance, that can really start to create shift within our therapy sessions. So resistance gets a bad rap, right? We think, oh, if I have resistance, then I don't want to be here. Or if I have resistance, then I'm not going to do the work. Or if I have resistance, that might make my therapist uncomfortable or me uncomfortable, or who knows who else might be uncomfortable if I have resistance. But it's actually so essential to the process, right? When we have resistance, what it's doing is showing us that there's a part of ourselves that is hesitant, or that there's a part of ourselves that we can start to develop or start to understand more. And it's really, resistance is just a part of our story, right? It's just one part of it. It's not all of it. It's not a depiction of who we are, but it's a part of our story. It's a part of our process when we're starting to understand and look at what's going on for us. So oftentimes, we get resistance because change might be scary. Change might be uncomfortable. I remember very, very early on in my journey towards learning about my mental health, someone said to me, well, one day you might not feel anxious. And I remember having the thought, how dare you tell me that I'm not going to be anxious one day, right? Like, I have an anxiety disorder. I'm going to feel anxious all the time. This is going to be a part of my story forever. And I held on to this label of anxiety. It was so important to me that people understood that I have anxiety. And therefore, there was no wiggle room for the anxiety to go anywhere. It had to be there all the time because it was a part of who I was. And at that point, I didn't believe it was a part. I believed it was all of me. I was an anxious person. It's how I defined myself. And as I moved through my journey of understanding the anxiety, and as I moved through the process of living with anxiety, I realized that the anxiety was a part of me. It was a part of my story. It was a part of how I showed up. And yes, there's always going to be a part of me that's an anxious person. And so I'm going to show up differently. I'm going to do things differently. I'm going to behave and respond differently because I have an overactive, anxious part. However, I don't experience anxiety all the time now. I don't have to define myself as an anxious person anymore. It's a part of me. It's something that I would like you to know about me, but it's not all of me anymore. And that distinction is so important. But it required me to move through the resistance to say it's okay to not be anxious all the time. It's okay to be okay. And when I was able to make that shift and when I was able to recognize that resistance, then I was able to accept that new information. So again, it's not about never having resistance. It's about acknowledging I don't want to go there yet. And then can I get there in that session? Or is it going to take me time to process this part? Right? And so for me, with identifying as an anxious person, that took years. It took years of talking about my anxiety and talking about who I was and finding other parts of myself so that I could put it aside and not let it define me. But I had to recognize that the resistance was there. And there's other things like, therapy is a journey that might take us to, just a little bit of time to think about and say, well, yeah, that makes sense. Right? So it's not, resistance isn't this big, bad, evil thing. In fact, I think it's really important when it shows up to session because it lets me know that we're heading in a direction that's going to create change. And so accepting resistance and knowing that it can be a part of therapy and it can be a catalyst for change allows us to have more compassion and understanding for resistance when it does show up in session.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Confessions of a Counselor podcast is available anywhere you like to listen to your podcast, both on Apple and Android. New episodes will be released every Friday. If you enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to join the conversation. Leave a review or subscribe to the podcast hosted on the Anchor app. All these details can be found at janicelyons.com. Until next time, take care.